I'm 38 now, but last year at 37, I found out exactly what it means to be disposable. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, the kind of town where family loyalty is supposed to mean something, where your parents are supposed to stand by you no matter what. Turns out, that's just a nice idea people like to tell themselves. It was my friend's sister, Jenna, who started the whole mess. She told anyone who would listen that I got her pregnant. A lie, straight from her lips, but one that stuck like grease on a white shirt. She spun her story so well my parents didn't even blink before they turned their backs on me. They didn't call me, didn't ask me to explain, didn't give me a chance to defend myself. They cut me off like I was some stray dog they found barking outside their window. Said I had betrayed them, shamed them. They were embarrassed. What hurt most wasn't Jenna's lie. It was that my own flesh and blood believed her without a second thought. All those years of trying to be the good son, the one who never asked for anything, the one who stepped up when my brother went off the rails or when my sister needed bailing out of some mess. It meant nothing. None of it counted. I was labeled a liar, a failure, an embarrassment. For months, I was out in the cold. No calls, no birthday wishes, no holidays. I tried to pretend it didn't sting, but the silence hollowed me out in ways I didn't know possible. I even caught myself drafting long-winded texts I never sent, thinking of excuses for them, thinking maybe they'd come around if I explained everything. But I stopped before hitting send, because deep down I knew, if they could believe a lie about me so easily, what else were they capable of believing? The worst twist? The paternity test came back, months later, proving I wasn't the father. I wasn't even in the ballpark. And suddenly, my parents were falling all over themselves, apologizing, begging me to forgive them. My mother cried, said she was sorry for ever doubting me. My father claimed he'd been under stress, that Jenna had seemed so convincing. But something inside me had snapped. I realized in that moment, standing in their kitchen as they stumbled over their apologies, that it didn't matter if they were sorry now. They'd throw me away without a second thought, and no amount of regret could stitch that back together. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cause a scene. I just said I was done. I told them I didn't need them in my life if they could so easily believe the worst about me. I moved out of Spokane for a bit after that, found a cheap place outside Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, where I could clear my head and start over. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. The real kicker? A month after the truth came out, Jenna admitted she lied, casually, over drinks with mutual friends. Said she'd been angry with me for not returning her texts after that one awkward night we all got a little too drunk. She thought she could get back at me by making my life hell. And it worked. But here's the twist. Jenna wasn't the only liar. That paternity test? It was never submitted by Jenna or her lawyer. My father secretly paid for the test. He told me later, quietly, that he wasn't entirely convinced by her story, but couldn't face the possibility that she might be telling the truth. He'd paid for the test behind everyone's back, hoping it would clear things up without dragging the family name through more mud. That's when it hit me. Even when he wasn't sure, he didn't have the guts to believe me or to stand by me. He hedged his bets. I can't say I'm proud of how I handled it all. I was bitter cold. But when you've been treated like an inconvenience in your own family, something freezes inside you. The months after the truth came out were some of the loneliest I've ever lived. I wake up in my tiny rental outside Coeur d'Alene, the walls bare, the air always a little too cold, even in the middle of summer. Some mornings I just lie there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself to get up and start the day. But mostly I just scroll through old photos on my phone, family barbecues, birthdays, random weekends that felt so normal back then. Now, they were like postcards from a life I didn't belong to anymore. It's funny. When you're a kid, you think your parents are your anchors, the people who will love you no matter what, the ones who will pick you up when you fall. I believed that for way too long. I think that's what hurt the most. The realization that love like that was conditional, fragile, something that could be snapped in half by a single lie. And they didn't just leave me out in the cold. They didn't just stop talking to me. They cut me off in ways I hadn't expected. Suddenly, family friends who used to invite me for dinner stopped reaching out. My aunt, the one who always made me pecan pie for my birthday, stopped replying to my texts. Even people at work looked at me differently. Jenna's story had spread faster than I thought possible, twisting through the small-town grapevine like a slow-motion train wreck. I remember one night, maybe 3 months in, sitting on the back steps of the rental, drinking a cheap beer, listening to the cicadas hum like they were the only living things that didn't care about the mess of my life. I thought about calling them, my parents, just to scream, just to get out of my system. But I didn't. I stayed quiet, letting the bitterness settle in my bones. And then came the text. It was Jenna. After months of silence, She finally texted me, casual as you please. Hey, just wanted to say I'm sorry. Things got a little out of hand. Hope you're doing okay. I stared at the screen so long I thought my eyes would dry out. That was it. No explanation. No apology that made sense. Just a little text like she was brushing off a spilled drink. I didn't reply. Not then. Not later. Not ever. A week after that, my father called. His voice was thin, brittle, like he'd been rehearsing what to say. You want to know if I come over for dinner to talk things through? My mother was making her famous roast. They miss me, he said. They wanted to start over. And for a split second, a tiny flicker of that old hope sparked inside me. I almost said yes. I almost believed that things could go back to the way they were. But then I remembered the silence, the betrayal, the way they believed a lie over their own son. And I said no. No, I wasn't coming. No, I didn't want to talk it through. No, I wasn't ready to forgive them for throwing me away so easily. That no wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. It was quiet, steady, like a door quietly closing. I think they finally realized then that I wasn't coming back. I kept waiting for the bitterness to wear off, for the sharp edges of betrayal to dull into something manageable. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, and all I felt was this cold clarity, like I'd been walking through life in a fog, and someone had finally wiped the glass clean. I could see it all now. The quiet favoritism, the whispered excuses, the way my parents always assumed I'd be the one to pick up the pieces when things fell apart. I started filling my time with work, long hours, mindless tasks. It wasn't that I loved what I did. It was just easier to stay busy than to sit in that empty apartment and feel the weight of everything I'd lost. I even considered moving back to Spokane at one point, but the thought of driving past my parents' house, of seeing them living their lives like I never existed, made me feel sick. So I stayed put in Coeur d'Alene. Got a job at a local hardware store. Nothing fancy, just enough to cover rent and groceries. It was the kind of job I used to think I'd never take. I told myself it was temporary, that I was just biding my time until I figured out what came next. But deep down, I knew I wasn't in any rush to rebuild. There was something oddly comforting about the simplicity of it. No family obligations, no one calling me with their problems, no expectations. The thing is, when you've spent your whole life trying to be the responsible one, the fixer, the guy everyone leans on, it's hard to admit when you just want to be left alone. But I was learning, slowly. One day, maybe 2 months after I'd moved, I ran into an old friend from high school at the grocery store. She asked how I'd been, and before I could even think, I blurted out, "Great. Just taking some time to focus on me." The lie was so smooth, it almost sounded true. But the truth was, I wasn't focusing on me. I was avoiding everyone else. The kicker came a few days later when I got a letter from my parents' lawyer. It was short and to the point. They were formally asking me to sign away any claim to the family estate. Apparently, my parents didn't want to leave any loose ends. They wanted everything tied up neatly for my brother, just in case something happened to them. I read the letter 3 times before setting it down on the kitchen table. For a long time, I just sat there, staring at it, trying to decide how angry I should feel. But the anger never came. Instead, I felt something colder. Resignation. They didn't just cut me off emotionally. They were making sure I couldn't come back. And maybe in a twisted way, that was the freedom I needed. I didn't sign the letter. Not right away. I left it sitting there on the kitchen table like a dare, like maybe it would burst into flames if I stared at it long enough. It didn't, of course. The world doesn't work like that. A week went by, then another. I kept expecting a follow-up call, some desperate plea from my parents asking why I hadn't returned the paperwork. But the call never came. That was when I realized something that should have been obvious. They weren't going to call. They'd already made their peace with cutting me out of their lives. That letter wasn't a plea. It was the final nail in the coffin. And that realization hurt more than I thought it would. Not because I wanted to go back to the way things were, I didn't. But because part of me, deep down, had still hope for something. A phone call. A letter. An acknowledgement that they were sorry, that they'd made a mistake. But none of that came. So one night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my mom. It was late, too late for it to be casual. I let it ring 3 times before hanging up. I didn't leave a message. I didn't try again. I think that was the moment I finally accepted it. Not the betrayal itself. I'd accepted that a long time ago. But the finality of it. The fact that they weren't going to come around, weren't going to apologize, weren't going to make it right. The next morning, I took the letter, folded it neatly, and slid it into the bottom drawer of my nightstand. I didn't sign it, but I didn't throw it away either. It was like I needed a reminder, a tangible piece of evidence that what happened was real. that this wasn't just a bad dream. I went to work that day and didn't think about it again. Not for a while, anyway. It was a Tuesday when he showed up. I was standing behind the counter at the hardware store, ringing up a customer's order for a box of screws and a paintbrush when I looked up and saw him. My brother, Eric. I hadn't seen him in almost a year. His hair was longer, messier, his clothes too nice for this part of town. Some designer jacket that looked out of place against the rows of PVC piping and drill bits. For a second, I just froze. My hands on the cash register. My heart a tight knot in my chest. He didn't look angry. Didn't look apologetic either. Just tired. Like he was carrying something he couldn't shake off. He waited until I finished with the customer and then stepped forward, resting his hands on the counter like he was bracing himself. He said, well, not said exactly. He mumbled something about how things hadn't been great back home, how mom and dad weren't doing well, how they'd asked him to reach out, see if I'd come back, if I'd help. I didn't say a word. He stood there, awkward, waiting for me to break the silence. But I didn't, because what was there to say? That I knew he'd been a favorite all along? That he'd benefited from their blind loyalty while I was left to fend for myself? That now, when things were crumbling, they wanted me to come back and play the role of the good son again? I just shook my head, slow and deliberate. Eric looked down at his hands. Then, with a sigh that sounded like it came from somewhere deep, he said he understood. That he was sorry things turned out this way. And for a moment, just a moment, I almost believed him. Almost believed that he really was sorry. That maybe he hadn't been the golden boy I'd painted him as in my head. But then he glanced at his phone, muttered that he had to get going, and walked out of the store. That was the last time I saw him. After Eric left, the days blurred together. I went to work, came home, cooked simple meals for myself, things that didn't require much thought. I'd sit on the couch with the TV on, not really watching, just letting the noise fill the silence. I didn't call anyone. I didn't check my messages. It was easier to let the world slip by unnoticed. Sometimes, though, in the middle of the night, I'd wake up with this sharp, hollow ache in my chest. Not the physical kind, the emotional one. The kind that reminded me I'd lost not just my family, but the person I used to be. The one who believed that doing the right thing, being dependable, would mean something in the end. That ache would creep in during the small moments. Folding laundry, washing a single plate after dinner, turning off the light before bed, and realizing there was no one else to wish goodnight. One morning, I found myself standing at the window, watching the sun come up over the neighbors' rooftops. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, and for a second, it looked almost beautiful. Almost like something worth waking up for. And for the first time in months, I realized I didn't feel bitter. I didn't feel angry. I just felt empty, and strangely, that emptiness felt better than the bitterness. It was like a clean slate. I wasn't ready to forgive them. I didn't think I ever would. But for the first time, I wasn't waiting for them to apologize. I wasn't waiting for them to change. I wasn't waiting for anyone to save me. I was learning to stand on my own. A couple weeks later, I got an invitation in the mail. Not from my parents, not from Eric, this was from Jenna. A wedding invitation, no less. I almost laughed out loud when I opened it. A crisp, white envelope, elegant script, her name at the top with some guy's name I didn't recognize. It was as if the past year hadn't happened, as if she hadn't detonated my life with her lie and walked away whistling. The date was a month away. The venue, a vineyard outside Spokane, no less. As if the location itself was mocking me, dragging me right back to where it all started. For a long time, I just stood there, staring at the invitation. It felt like a joke, like she was testing me, seeing if I'd show up, sit quietly at the back, pretend everything was fine. But I wasn't that person anymore. I dropped the invitation in the trash, poured myself a drink, and sat on the back steps watching the sky turn dark. And for the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't bitterness or emptiness. I felt free. That night, sitting on the back steps, I did something I'd avoided for months. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my old messages, and found Jenna's number. I stared at it for a long time. My thumb hovered over the screen, tempted to type out all the things I wanted to say. How she'd ruined me. How her lie had cost me not just my family, but my sense of self. How I'd spent months hating her, then hating myself for letting her get to me. But no words felt right. Anything I sent would feel small, petty compared to what I'd been through. And in that moment, I realized the truth, the real reason I hadn't reached out all this time. Because deep down, I knew that no apology, no explanation, no conversation could ever undo what she'd done. So I put the phone down. I let the silence stretch around me, the cool night air settling on my skin like a quiet absolution. I didn't need her to acknowledge me. I didn't need closure. I was already done. I don't know what possessed me to go back. Maybe it was some misplaced sense of obligation. Maybe it was curiosity, wanting to see with my own eyes what had become of the people who once meant everything to me. I drove to Spokane one gray Sunday afternoon. The roads were quiet, the sky hanging low with clouds that threatened rain. I parked a block away from the house, sat in the car with the engine idling, and just stared at the front door. It was the same house I'd grown up in, but it looked smaller somehow, like the weight of everything that had happened had shrunk it down to something unremarkable. I almost turned around, almost put the car back in gear and drove away. But then I got out, walked up the sidewalk, and knocked on the door. My mother answered. Her face, once so familiar, looked older, thinner. She blinked in surprise, then tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She stepped aside to let me in, like we were still pretending this was normal. Like we hadn't spent a year avoiding each other's existence. Inside, the house smelled the same, coffee, dust, and that faint scent of wood polish they always used. But it felt hollow, like a stage set abandoned after the actors had gone home. I stood there, not knowing what to say. My father appeared from the kitchen, looking tired, his shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. They didn't ask why I'd come. They didn't ask how I was. They just stood there, waiting. I realized then that I wasn't there to fix anything. I wasn't there to forgive them or make peace. I was there to see for myself, to confirm that they were still the same people who had thrown me away when it mattered most. And they were. I nodded once, quietly, and left. After that last visit, something shifted inside me. I stopped checking my phone for messages that weren't coming. I stopped wondering if they'd reach out. The silence became less like a punishment and more like a kind of freedom. I kept going to work at the hardware store, kept coming home to my quiet apartment. But I started doing little things, things I'd put off for months. I painted the walls a new color, bought a secondhand armchair that fit perfectly in the corner by the window. I planted a few pots of herbs on the balcony, even though I'd never been good at keeping plants alive. For the first time in a long time, I was doing things just for me. Not because someone else needed them. Not because I was trying to hold everything together. Just because I wanted to. One evening, I sat in that new armchair, sipping coffee and watching the sunset. And I realized I hadn't thought about them, my parents, Jenna, Eric, in days. Maybe even weeks. That was when I knew. I'd crossed the tipping point. I wasn't waiting for their apology, their acknowledgement, or their understanding anymore. I wasn't holding on to the bitterness or the need to prove anything. I was free. I don't know what I expected when I reached this point. Maybe some grand revelation, a moment of clarity where all the pain made sense. But it wasn't like that. The truth is, there was no dramatic conclusion, no perfect resolution. Just me, sitting on that balcony in Coeur d'Alene, watching the light fade from the sky, realizing that this was my life now. And it was okay. I wasn't the person I used to be, the one desperate for approval, for love, for validation. I wasn't the person who let a single lie unravel everything I'd worked for. I was someone new, someone who understood that sometimes the people you think you need the most are the ones who will hurt you the deepest. Someone who knew that family isn't just about blood, it's about trust. I'd lost my family, but I'd found something else, myself. And as I sat there in the quiet, the last traces of sunlight painting the horizon, I felt the weight of it all lift just a little.